Right, I'm going to talk about issues facing trade unionists, specifically around trade union rights and civil liberties of trade unionists in countries affected by conflict. And I'm going to profile the Philippines, Colombia, and Turkey. I want to try and show some patterns in how risks to trade unionists' civil liberties are brought about, identify who's responsible for these situations, and to look at strategies for bringing about effective change to reduce the violations, protect trade unionists from harm, and to overcome impunity, which is a recurring problem. I'm going to start talking about the Philippines. And I'm going to basically outline a number of different issues in each country and then come up with some conclusions. Okay, in the Philippines, you've got one of the issues is that senior state officials have stigmatized trade unionists. So you've got people right up at presidential level and senior members of the military and civil servants portraying trade unionists as members of illegal armed groups and blurring the distinction between combatants and legal organisations. This has led to very serious violations of the civil liberties of trade unionists, and it's put them at risk of serious harm. Some of those responsible for committing harm against trade unionists and other human rights defenders in Philippines are the military. And there are no confirmed cases of this because there are no convictions of military personnel responsible. But I think there's no doubt that this happens. This is confirmed by senior people at the UN, by the extrajudicial executions special rapporteur, and others who've studied the situation. But it's not only the military committing violations against trade unionists, it's also violence from unknown persons, and they're unknown because these cases are not solved either. They tend to be masked gunmen on motorbikes, and this often happens in industrial disputes. A masked gunman on a motorbike will drive past and shoot one of the union leaders, often during a dispute. Dozens of murders have been reported over the last 10 years. Reporting is often a bit confused. The situation can seem like the murder rate is much higher than it actually is because of duplicate reporting and some confusion between whether people are leftists, community organisers or trade unionists. And trying to focus on just trade unionists who've been murdered, it's about 4 to 7 a year, pretty consistently over the past 10 years. So you can understand that's quite a lot of people over a 10-year period. There's no clear pattern up or down. It's a fluctuating figure. It's not getting better or worse. The total rate of extrajudicial killings observed by the UN Special Rapporteur was at its peak 220 in a year, and that was 2006. That had fallen quite dramatically to 64 by 2008. I should point out the Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Executions visited in 2007, and it seems to have had a pretty dramatic impact on the rate of murders, that attention from the UN, and the profile of that report, which was a very high-profile report in human rights policy circles. But as I understand it, the levels have pretty much stabilised and have not gone down further since then. Speak about the role of the military. There's very strong evidence linking the military to a number of the trade union murders. And they're routinely implicated in violence against all sorts of community organisers and people referred to as leftists, which is a kind of cover-all term for those on the left. It seems to equate all left activists with the left guerrilla group MPA, and it seems suspicious of networks. It seems to not understand what a network is and what an informal community organisers network is. It seems deeply hostile to that kind of way of organising. And I think in some ways this is the military's perception of what a network is. If you look at the military does not encourage informal networks within its ranks, right? It relies on top-down discipline. And so when it encounters these networks, it doesn't really understand what they are or how to deal with them. And this is a recurring theme that will come up in other countries. However, the military has repeatedly denied allegations that it's involved in murdering trade unionists, but it's uncooperative with civilian investigations, and it does not investigate abuses in which soldiers are implicated. There is impunity for these cases on an extraordinary level. Investigatory bodies are paralysed by inefficiency. They lack resources, and they also seem to lack the will to investigate crimes. Human Rights Watch looked into this in some detail, and they reported that investigators often do not visit crime scenes. They collect only the most basic evidence. Evidence is often contaminated, and the chain of custody of evidence is often broken. They interview only family members or the most obvious witnesses. And crucially, police routinely avoid pursuing any evidence of military involvement. This is for various reasons, including the disorganised and apparently... Yeah, sure, do I need to hold this? Right, okay. I can just shout if that's... Yeah, okay. Police stations are very disorganised, but the reasons for not pursuing military involvement seem as much as anything to be actual fear of retribution from the military by the police, which is this is a very difficult situation, but it's the kind of situation we could look into doing something about, because you've got two formal institutions, and formal institutions are easier to tackle with human rights reforms than informal institutions. There are concerns about the militarisation of industrial relations. Police and military, heavily armed, are often sent to industrial disputes as a show of force. Trade unionists are also subjected to arrests, detentions and other forms of harassment. We've got a particular problem here, which is the police and the army are secretive, and people are frequently taken into detention, and nobody knows they've been taken into a detention, so they're reported as possibly executed, which is another reason that keeping track of what the rate of extrajudicial executions is very difficult, because people go missing for months at a time and then they reappear again and they've been in secret military detention. The government fails to grasp the problem. It refers to isolated incidents. And also, harking back to what I said originally about the government stigmatising trade unionists, I've got here some comments that the government made to ILO. We only pursue trade unionists who are committing rebellion. This is a government quote. There is a thin line dividing some trade unionists from the illegal activities of certain rebel groups. This is a quote from the government. Where a trade unionist crosses this line, there should be no question of the legitimacy of police or military action. Another quote from the government. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions, who I've mentioned earlier, I'm going to quote from him. The government sanctioned killings of members of civil society groups. So there's fairly clear evidence that this stigmatisation is taking place. I also want to quote from the Special Rapporteur again on this link between the political and the industrial, because there's often a question in countries in conflict whether trade unionists are targeted for political reasons or for industrial reasons. And I think the rapporteur made a very insightful analysis of this. So I'll quote a short paragraph. Disputes surrounding organising campaigns and collective bargaining negotiations appear often to be the motivating factor behind decisions to attack workers and organisers. But the likelihood that such an attack will take the extreme form of an extrajudicial execution appears to be far higher if the worker is associated with what is purported to be a CCP front group. That would be the Communist Party allied with the MPA guerrilla group. So what he's saying is that violence against trade unionists occurs during the context of disputes. There's no doubt about that. But it's likely to be more severe if it's a leftist union involved in a dispute, who can be conflated with terrorism by the kind of stigmatisation that the government is engaged in. We've also got a problem. The trade union movement is fractured into many groups. There are many divisions, and that affects reporting, and it also affects, in some ways, the response to the situation. You had a very unfortunate situation in 2007 when workers at the ILO, the whole international workers group, were condemning violence against trade unionists in Philippines, and the Philippines workers representative said that this wasn't actually a problem. Because it was they have a political disagreement at home with the left-wing unions that are the victims of the most serious violations. So I think that really was quite jaw-dropping, the extent to which that failure of the local unions to overcome their political differences, when it enters the human rights sphere, can become quite jarring. However, in more recent years, the Philippine worker rep has dropped that position and is now basically speaking the same language as the international labour movement. I'll move on now to Colombia, where you'll hear some of the same kind of issues coming up, and it's interesting to see the parallels. It's the most severe repression of civil rights of trade unionists in the world, without question. More trade unionists have been killed in Colombia than in any other country, both over the longer term and in the past few years, despite a reduction in the overall numbers being killed each year. In 2010, so that's fairly recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders declared herself, quote, gravely concerned for the plight of trade unionists in Colombia. Trying to give a context, the exact numbers of violations is a disputed figure, and this is an area of quite intense political disagreement between the government and its allies and trade unionists. And of course, facts and figures change over the years, but there's broad agreement that around 3,000 trade unionists were killed between 1986 and 2002. 2002 was quite a peak for anti-union violence. 184 trade unionists were killed in that year alone. That's an ILO figure, by the way, 184. More recent figures show the murder rate has declined, but remains appallingly high. In the 2013 ITUC report, at least 18 trade unionists are identified as killed in Colombia. But that has got to be matched by a figure of 359 death threats, which is an increase in death threats. So you've got a decrease in the murder rate, but an increase in the overall level of threats. So that has to be borne in mind when people talk about the situation getting better. People are still living under a permanent state of threat. Move on to look again at impunity is a major problem, as in Philippines. The Colombian Commission of Jurists, which is a lawyers' non-governmental organisation, says 41 extrajudicial executions of trade unionists are directly attributable to state forces between 1986 and 2008. But of course, we don't have anything like that rate of convictions for military involvement, although I'll mention later we do have some. Over this period in which 3,000 murders took place, only 376 criminal investigations were conducted. And of course, not all of those resulted in guilty verdicts. Not by any means. Hang on a minute. Yep, 5 cases resulted in guilty verdicts for 3,000 murders. Even though there was an improvement in that following reforms to and quite a lot of spending on prosecution and investigation services and the creation of specialised subunits within the prosecution department, even though all this accelerated in recent years, workers at the ILO still said, at the current rate of sentencing, it would take 37 years for justice to overcome impunity, always assuming that no more murders occurred, and that the unit remained in place at its current rate. In 2012, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights observed that impunity remains a structural problem. The justice system is overburdened and inefficient. It's hampered by intimidation of judges. Prosecutors and witnesses are also intimidated. And there's a lack of resources. That is in spite of the recent amount of spending on improving those resources. It still remains subject to those limitations. Let's talk about the military involvement. In a major scandal, it emerged in 2004, members of the military had murdered civilians and presented the victims as members of the guerrillas. 3 members of the Health Workers Union and TOC were murdered in this way. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions found such practices were, and I'll quote from the rapporteur, not carried out as a matter of state policy, but were not isolated occurrences. There were incentives in place, and the killings were carried out by a large number of military units. The military were incentivized to kill civilians and present the victims as members of the guerrillas. And in the Antok case, this were 3 members of the Health Workers Union who'd been killed in this way by the military. In another scandal, it emerged that the security services were compiling lists of trade unionists and handing them to paramilitary groups in Colombia. And the UN rapporteur has commented on that and was very pleased to note that 40 civil servants from that security organisation were being investigated and prosecuted. To talk about stigmatisation, because this is another recurring theme happening in Colombia as well. To look at the rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, paramilitaries targeted government critics, in particular human rights defenders, trade unionists and journalists, for their perceived leftist sympathies with guerrillas. The state and paramilitaries saw such criticism as a threat to social order and contributed to the stigmatisation of such persons. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders reported that she was shown video footage of public statements made by the President of Colombia in which human rights defenders were portrayed as colluding with terrorists or guerrilla members. Remember, this is the rapporteur still speaking here. The judicial police, army, and regional units of the Attorney General's office made similar statements. Again, industrial bargaining was a real issue, as well as this political association with conflict. The local trade union school, the ENS, reported on human rights violations against trade unionists in 2003, and they reported that 90% of human rights violations against trade unionists were rooted in core activities such as bargaining and disputes, with just 10% thought to be connected with the armed conflict. A US State Department report for the same period agreed broadly and said, a quote from the US State Department, paramilitaries threatened and sometimes killed union members who refused to renounce collective bargaining agreements. So you've got many of the same situations reflected there in Philippines and Colombia. I want now to talk about Turkey, which has differences as well as similarities, and it's quite interesting to pull these together. You've got stigmatization of trade unionists by the state in Turkey. Repeatedly, trade unionists are labelled as terrorists, and their activities are conflated with those of the illegal armed groups in Turkey. You have the mass arrest of trade unionists and concerns about the fairness of criminal investigations and trials. There is violent repression of trade union demonstrations. Water cannon and tear gas are used against trade unionists frequently. People are beaten with batons. This happens frequently at trade union demonstrations. Trade union premises and trade unionists' homes have been raided by the police. In 2010, the ITUC reported what it called judicial harassment against trade unionists, referring to the Kesk trial, where proceedings were brought against 31 public sector trade unionists, mostly teachers. I observed one of these trials, and I have to say I didn't like what I saw one bit, and neither did other human rights defenders and legal observers. There was a failure by the prosecution to even attempt to outline its case. The defendants were simply called to basically implicate themselves and give evidence against a case they hadn't heard. Defenders, lawyers hadn't seen the full prosecution evidence. There was blatant inequality of arms between the prosecutor and the defendants' lawyers. And the whole trial seemed to me something of a farce. It was scheduled for a series of 2-day hearings, which, when you're looking into 31 defendants contesting possible 10-year prison sentences for terrorist offences, a 2-day scheduling for all those people, it was absurd. And I've heard that from a number of people who observed these trials. I don't have overall figures for the numbers arrested, but it's got to be hundreds. Over the past 4 or 5 years, it's certainly hundreds, because there have been several incidents in which 100 or more people were arrested at once. Dozens of these have been prosecuted. My best guess from a rough overview of figures I have are that around 50 trade unionists have been sentenced, and in most cases to quite seriously long sentences, 5 years or more, essentially for which is harassment for trade union activities, but it's presented as terrorism. In 2010, the Minister of Labour declined to meet an ILO high-level mission that was sent to the country to investigate this situation and to look at the labour law issues, but it was all primarily to look at this harassment of trade unionists. Now, obviously, there's a key difference here. That's the big problem is, yes, violence, but not really murders. And it seems to be arrests rather than murders and threats of violence in Turkey as opposed to Colombia and Philippines. That's a key difference, but a key similarity is that, lo and behold, those responsible for arresting the trade unionists, those conducting the investigations against them and prosecuting them, are the Jandarma, which is a branch of the military. It's a civil defence police-style unit, but it's actually a branch of the military. So this harassment is coming directly from the military. And the cases have been heard in former military courts, which have just recently transferred to civilian jurisdiction. Excuse me. Okay, I want to try and wrap up there and look at what can we say about this. There are obviously numerous problems, and there are very complex situations in each case. The 3 cases where we could have talked about any one country in great detail. I've tried to give you a broad overview of the 3. What I think might be most useful for me to do is to give an example of 3 areas in which I think work can be done to try and improve this situation. In my view, we need to target the government, and the government needs to stop stigmatising trade unionists. And this shouldn't just apply to trade unionists that are allied with the government politically, but to all trade unionists in the country, regardless of their political sympathies, because really it's the stigmatisation of trade unionists that is causing this problem. in many ways. It's feeding into other problems. How do we do that? I think international supervisory mechanisms such as ILO and the UN are the key to putting this kind of pressure on governments. They are genuinely embarrassed to be called to account for this in those arenas, and we need to make sure that they are repeatedly called to account for this stigmatization in as many such arenas as possible. Every opportunity we get, we need to call them to account for this. The military, in some ways I think it's about training, and it's about the fact that the military are not equipped to understand trade unionists. They don't understand this idea of networks, informal networks, particularly in rural areas where the military are fighting counterinsurgency operations. They perceive informal networks as a problem. And it's kind of understandable that the military should do that. An informal network within the military is a problem. They're not encouraged to think that that is okay. Some people dismiss military human rights training as a PR exercise, but I think it's got a genuine, there can be a genuine point to it and a purpose to it. It can potentially help overcome that issue, help them understand what trade unions are and how trade unions work. Obviously, that alone is not going to resolve the situation. It needs to be matched by a change in the government's tone and attitude towards trade unionists. And if these things happen simultaneously, they'll reinforce one another. The third straw here is courts, and basically the courts and judicial system, prosecutions need strengthening and improving. This is very expensive, but it needs to be done. And in several of these countries, it's about improving civilian control over the military. In Turkey, especially, and in Philippines, and in Colombia as well, to be honest. So what we need there is witness protection, security for investigators and prosecutors, and training and equipment for all stages of the investigation and prosecution process. These steps are complementary, and I think in isolation won't do much, but handled together could be an important way of tackling some aspects of these problems. You'll note that I haven't recommended steps that target the illegal armed groups, and I think that that's because steps that target legal, lawful, open structures are much easier to implement and more likely to be effective. I also think that if you can change the culture of impunity and violence in these formal arenas, you can influence the other actors in those states. Unions, I think, on the whole, are responding quite well to these situations. There are problems with a lack of unity in some cases, particularly the Philippines example in 2007, which I've referred to. Although even that is now overcome, and the Philippines colleagues are working well together. It's important for unions to build effective, balanced and coherent strategies and responses, and I think to help their governments to look at responses like the ones I've proposed and to feed into that. But otherwise, I think unions are doing great in terms of the campaigning work and awareness raising that has been done on these countries already. And that is basically my contribution. Thank you very much.